Yep.
All right. Doing the standards is sort of doubly challenging. Cindy has probably heard Scott talk about this at least once, where not only do you have to try to say at least one sentence that most of them will remember as late as lunch, you also have to say something that everybody who is listening to you will not have heard 10,000 times before. And I mean, that's sort of like threading Scylla and Charybdis, if you remember your Greek mythology. The rock on the one hand and the hard place or the whirlpool on the other. But the first thing I thought of when I came to this holiday was an old episode of the series Seventh Heaven, which was about a community church pastor, his wife, and their 5, later 7 children. And very early on, they had an episode, might even have been first season, it certainly wasn't past second, where the pastor's sister comes to visit them, and unknown to the family, she's an alcoholic. And the signs that all is not right grow during the visit, and eventually it gets to the point where she makes the 2 youngest children feel threatened. The mother, of course, sails, as Joyce would have put it, the battleship mama sails in, with full guns turned on the target. And, the story comes out. And the pastor who is a trained counselor decides to hold his sister's drying out period in their house. His wife is not at all keen about this. Some of the older children one of the older daughters is dead set against it because she had looked up to this aunt and was very disappointed. The middle daughter was, just wanted everybody to love each other. And essentially, the pastor locks his sister in his and his wife's bedroom. This is just before Thanksgiving. And, she is not allowed to be in there without somebody in there with her the entire time. And it takes a toll. Meanwhile, the oldest children especially decide that they are going to cook the Thanksgiving meal. And none of them, of course, has much training as a cook. Let's just put it that way. And finally in time for the big day, but not in time for the mother to supervise the meal, the worst of it is over. The aunt is allowed to come down and join the family at the table, and the father says that he appreciates this Thanksgiving perhaps more than others because it's hard fought for. And that they will, first they'll identify the food and then they'll eat it. When you have children between late teen and preschool pitching in on something, the results can be mixed at best. Let's just put it that way. But I mean, that phrase, a hard fought for Thanksgiving, has stuck with me over the years. Ollie, I know, will know this, and probably most of the rest of you will as well, that the first Thanksgiving at Plymouth was hard fought for as well. And we won't go into the specifics of the well-worn story, the trip across the ocean, the storm that nearly sank them, my ancestor John Howland getting swept overboard and pulled back, the whole thing. And half of them dying that first winter. I will say that the mortality rate at Jamestown was even worse for a long time. But that was probably because Jamestown was built the edge of a swamp.
Yeah.
So.
And the malaria.
All sorts of things, David.
And
They starved to death.
Right. But it was hard. It was hard fought for. And when they came to the end of September with a little bit of a surplus, they decided to have sort of a combination harvest celebration, which would have taken place just as September turns into October. That's what they were used to. And there were only 4 women left in the entire colony. So they cooked the meal. They were Mary Brewster, Susanna Winslow, Elizabeth Hopkins, and Eleanor Billington. And they were helped by 5, possibly 6 teenage girls. They were the only ones left. Constance Hopkins, Priscilla Mullins, as in the courtship of Miles Standish, Elizabeth Tilley, who was my ancestor, Mary Chilton, who, according to tradition, was the first one to step foot on Plymouth Rock, and one of the serving girls who was possibly one of the serving girls who was in the household of John Carver, who had been governor of the colony until he died suddenly in the spring, who would soon marry Frances Eaton. And possibly another girl named Desire Minter, who eventually gave up and went back to England. And they started out cooking for something like 50 to, let's say around 55 people. And they did not invite the Wampanoags at first. But they were celebrating firing their guns. And the Wampanoags, according to the way the Wampanoags remember it, they heard the gunfire and came armed. The Massasoit, whose personal name was Usamaquin. Massasoit just means great chief. He and 90 warriors showed up to help defend the place against whoever was attacking it. At this point, the Pilgrim leadership, all male of course, who did not have to cook the meal, had the grace to invite their allies to the celebration, which went on 3 days. Often we don't remember the mundane details of who helps us. In this case, not only the Wampanoag, who came there to defend their new ally, but also the women and girls who actually cooked the meal, and who had the grace not to put up too much of a fuss when the men invited all of these natives who were almost twice as many as the settlers. I mean, you can say that, I mean, you can point to the fact that they weren't originally invited. The good Puritans of Boston wouldn't have invited them at all. Instead of belatedly, they wouldn't have invited them at all, and they probably, well, by that point, they wouldn't have made a treaty with them. I was reading an article just this morning, actually, about Thanksgiving from an English point of view, which suggested, in light of the current battles over the memory of the holiday, that perhaps the best way forward is to think of it in the same terms as Camelot, the Arthurian one, not the JFK one. That it was a time, a brief and shining moment, that outside forces doomed to brevity, when two very different cultures came together with the best of intentions. Often what we intend is not what we get. In the words of the Gawain poet, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, late 14th century, the ending to the outset is equal but seldom. But it was a hard fought for Thanksgiving. The second one was hard fought for and didn't happen until 1623, because what with new settlers arriving all the time, they didn't have surplus food again until then. And in 1623, they had a drought. And the Thanksgiving was connected with praying for the end of and thanking God for the end of the drought, where they all nearly starved. When he comes to discuss the Mayflower reaching Cape Cod at Provincetown, William Bradford, who is our only source for the voyage, has this to say: "What could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? May not Englishmen which came over this great ocean and were ready to perish in this wilderness, but they cried unto the Lord, and He heard their voice, and looked on their adversity, etc. Let them therefore praise the Lord, because He is good, and His mercies endure forever. Yea, let them which have been redeemed of the Lord show how He hath delivered them from the hand of the oppressor, when they wandered in the desert out of the way, and found no city to dwell in, both hungry and thirsty, their soul was overwhelmed in them. Let them confess before the Lord His loving kindness and His wonderful works before the sons of men," which is a conflation of one passage from Deuteronomy and one from the 107th Psalm, which has the very famous passage about those who go down to the sea in ships. And this big storm comes up, and they cry to the Lord, who delivers them from the storm. I mean, Bradford essentially seared that passage into the background of the American mind, probably forever after. Those early pilgrims were grateful for what had happened to them. John Milton, in Paradise Lost, observes, "The mind is a place unto itself, and can make a heaven of hell a hell of heaven." Many of you might not know this, but between the time I was in my late teens and my mid-20s, that, a lot of people seem to read science fiction and fantasy at that age, and I was no exception. Since I have more of an archaic and mythic imagination, I tended more towards the fantasy. And one of the series I read was The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, one of the dreariest sets of novels I've ever come across. I liked it at the time because it was refreshing to have to look words up. Ollie might know what that's like. Yeah. Thomas Covenant, the title character, is a leper, and he's an outcast in his community. And by various means, he gets transported to this alternate world which is known simply as the Land. And on one of his early journeys, he is put into the company of a giant with the wonderful name of Saltheart Foamfollower. And the giants are cognizant of having had to escape to the land from their homeland. That there was a great desecration of some sort that came on them. It seems to have been connected with despite, which is sort of like a cross between evil and despair. And their response is this. The giants are not a numerous people. They don't reproduce very quickly. And finding that Covenant doesn't have any glad tales to tell his giantish companion, Saltheart says this: all that desecration, ravage, and rapine for a false hope. But we have a saying, and it comforts our children, few as they are, when they weep for the nation, the homes, and the company of our people which we lost. We say, joy is in the ears that hear, not in the mouth that speaks. The world has few stories glad in themselves, and we must have gay ears, or you could also say brave ears in this case, to defy despite. Praise the Creator. This Thanksgiving is probably almost as hard one as last year. So right now, I'm going to I'm going to have Mary cut off the recording in just a second. And when we go into the silence, I want us all to consider what it is we're thankful for. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 is, in all things give thanks. I think I can do that part of the time. I am not to the point where I can do the verse in Ephesians about for all things give thanks. So, shall we center down?